Welcome in to FANRUN TV, another YouTube exclusive. John Reed, joined by Jesse Simonton, a veteran college football reporter, formerly of Knoxville. My buddy, Jesse, good to see you, man. How are you?
I wish we were on Reed's Ranch talking maybe a little Survivor, a little challenge. I know Challenge 41 just started.
Now you say that, but the last time I tried to talk with you, you're like, I'm not really current right now. I'm not really watching. I feel like the last time I asked you.
You're right, but then I got, you know what? Then Bananas came back and it changed it all. Now I've been Survivor steady, so I can't wait for 50. I know there's a lot of controversy around it, but
I've missed the last 2 Survivors. I have them in my DVR, but I just haven't brought myself to go watch them. I don't know why. It got to season 48, and I was like, okay, I'll catch up, and then I just never did.
Well, if you're going to watch 50, I suggest you're going to need to watch this last one because there's like three or four homies on that one that are going to be a major alliance when the big Survivor 50 comes around, I think in the fall.
Have you got into Traitors at all? You watching Traitors on NBC, on Peacock?
Wife and I love Traitors. Love Traitors. I actually think the second season has been the best one so far.
Yeah.
I just think there was way better like characters and personalities in that one. This last one was just, I don't know, a little bit rote. I'm hoping for a comeback this next time, but it's fun. It's a fun show.
My biggest complaint there is that it's all famous people, which it's good as a viewer. You're able to kind of have some backstory, but also like it backfires on people and like their preconceived notions and what you know about them. I mean, like, it's hard to come in there as famous and actually win. Like if you're actually like considered a good player. You kind of saw that in season 3. But look, we're reality TV guys. We're used to dealing with drama, behind the scenes, alliances, and all that. And right now, that's the big story here in Knoxville with Boo Carter and what's going on at the University of Tennessee program. Even, months ago, Nico Iamaleava and all that. So as a reality TV expert, or at least a fan, it helps me maneuver here in Knoxville dealing with these stories.
So is it manufactured drama, Reed, or is it deal or no deal?
Look, you still got your sources. You're still in the game. I'm sure you've heard just as much in Knoxville about Boo Carter, Nico that we all have, but
the streets be talking.
The streets be talking, and that was the thing on Saturday was that I started getting text messages from people saying, "Hey, the streets are talking," and it was like on the very negative side, like, "Hey, this guy might be into some real trouble." And like, hey, he's already kind of missing practice. He's missing meetings, but also there might be some street life going on that Tennessee might not have a choice. And it does feel like that has since subsided. And we're just focusing now on a player going AWOL on his teammates, maybe because his teammates beat his ass. Like that's kind of the latest here. Jesse, what years were you here in Knoxville covering the Vols?
Oh, I was there for what I think a lot of Tennessee fans consider maybe the modern nadir, which would be right at basically all of Butch, and then basically Pruitt's first season and first 2 seasons.
Okay, so you would have been here at the beginning with Dre Bowles and just all the rumors there and the falling on a helmet and fighting and everything. So
Shy Tuttle.
Well, we used to have this all the time, a decade ago, and it's kind of calmed down up until this offseason, and it's boiling back over. But I feel like fighting in a locker room isn't that unusual. Like from your experience, do you feel like that is something that, if it's true, can't be, you can't come back from it, or is it just something that we should be panicking about? Because to me, it feels common.
No, I think that these sorts of stories and things, if it is just a locker room brouhaha, happen everywhere across the country. In July and August, especially when it starts getting hot later in August when they're in the middle of camp. To me, and a tweet that I tossed out, and it got some blowback from Tennessee fans, and some others were like, Jesse, I agree. This whole off season, when you include Nico to now what's happening with Boo, it just feels like the vibes are weird, obviously. And for a program that, like you said, when I was covering it as a beat writer and then, columnist, you've been there on the ground, leading the
Hell no, Shiano.
Greg,
Hell no.
Greg there, and then to where we are now, it just feels like what Heupel has done. 11 wins, 9 wins, 10 wins last year, get to the playoff, that this train should be really moving, in a positive forward momentum direction. And I don't think it's off the tracks by any means, but it sure as hell feels like it's like stopped. And it's just like, where are we? Which direction are we going to send this thing?
It's interesting because on one hand, I don't disagree with your premise. On the other hand, like the fellow fans that I talk to, the people I deem as pretty smart Tennessee fans, they're all complaining because it's been a fairly boring offseason, or one that maybe not boring, but just one without a lot of hype, one that there's been no real drama outside of Nico. We don't really know what the team is going to look like, but like you can't really dissect too many wins and losses because you don't know what your quarterback's going to look like. And now you get to Boo Carter. And 10 years ago, people would have been freaking out and hanging on to all these types of players. But now it's just kind of, I think, morphed into, if he leaves, he leaves. If he's gone, he's gone. It's not that big of a loss. I think people have bought into what Heupel said with Nico, where he said, hey, no one's bigger than the T. So I feel like maybe losing your starting quarterback kind of softened people up to not really freak out about a nickelback / punt returner / wannabe wide receiver. At least that's the vibe I'm getting from people.
That's fair. I would, if I'm going to offer a counter, I'd say there's at least a little bit difference of, for instance, I don't think a lot of folks are talking about Georgia, and all of a sudden I think A&M has gotten a lot of shine, but I think for the majority of the offseason, even A&M was kind of operating a little bit quietly, where they weren't being talked about nearly as much as Oklahoma, Alabama, Florida, Auburn, these other programs in the SEC. Tennessee was not being talked about a ton either, aside from this massive issue of losing Nico. I would say there's a difference, though, between what's happening at Georgia and A&M versus, it's a hell of a, Tennessee got put NIL on the map because of the whole Nico Iamaleava situation. For that to then, cascade down on themselves. And I think they got, a really nice, insurance policy in Joey Aguilar, but he doesn't have the upside of Nico. And just the pure optics of losing Nico, what does that mean for your program, collective, et cetera, moving on? There's no doubt that Heupel, I think, was able to spin this as a huge win. Him puffing his chest and saying no one's bigger than the T, that certainly rallied him for Tennessee fans. But now it's going to be really on him making a kid who's not as good as Nico good, especially when you don't have Dylan Sampson and some of these parts that you had a year ago.
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you and kind of dive into the SEC and dive into Tennessee is because you're not here in Knoxville anymore. You're not kind of beaten over the head with it. You're not kind of dealing with it every day. I'm always curious about the overhead view from people a little bit further removed. So it sounds like you're pretty down on the Vols in 2025. Is that fair to say?
I think I was more kind of confused because I just don't know what we're going to see. I think if Tennessee is 90% of as good as they were a year ago, so let's say they take that 10% upside of Nico away, you don't have Dylan Sampson, but maybe the defense is a little bit better. Maybe the offensive line, despite having some new pieces, coalesces a little bit more. Obviously, they're going to have some youth there. You're probably starting a 5-star freshman at tackle. But I think if you should get 90% of what you were a year ago, Tennessee might still be a playoff team because I think the schedule, the way it sets up, is fairly favorable. Okay. But if you're taking a step back, maybe if the receiver room is still not as good, if Mikey Matthews doesn't make that leap, if Braswell is still kind of just a dude instead of supposed to be the dude that they recruited him to be, then I think you could see 8-4. And where does Tennessee fans look at that after saying, hey, we thought this was going to be another kind of like ascension season?
Yeah, that's so interesting because you were here during the Butch era, and we talked about the fights and all the rumors, and Butch always just found himself in the news for stuff he said or things that happened, and that was while you're going 7-6 and 9-4 and not necessarily winning at a big level. Whereas Josh, as you just pointed out, has had some pretty good seasons, has made the playoff last year, would have made it in 2022 had it been extended and expanded. So the stakes a little bit different, but I'm happy to hear from a selfish standpoint of somebody who has to live and cover this and roots for the Vols that you still think there is a path to the playoff, because that's how I feel. But you're right that on the flip side, there is a path to some regression where you're losing some games and you're kind of taking those steps back because of the quarterback, because of maybe some other pieces that don't pan out. But, you kept using that word upside with Nico, and I was enamored with it too. And you're not wrong. Like, Nico does have first round potential and does have those tools. But in terms of like what he actually put on the field last year, you can't really use the word upside for that, because to me, upside implies of like what he could have been. Now, I was arguing with fans this year. Yeah, I was arguing with fans like, when it was happening in April, they're like, let him go, get him out of here. He wasn't that good this past year. And I'm like, yeah, I get that. But like, the hope is that he gets better in 2025, right? That the talent he starts living up to that talent. That was my hope of Nico. Now, I will say, when I see some statistics with Aguilar, like, it does seem the metrics say he throws a better deep ball. And I do think that's something that Nico really, really struggled with last year.
My man couldn't throw it in the ocean. I mean,
he could get in the ocean. He's just not hitting the boat. He's going like 20 yards past the boat.
No, I don't even know if he could throw it in the. I mean, like, that thing was always, you didn't know where that helicopter was going. And I think on that end, I think Heupel could be in a little bit of FU mode with like, maybe I don't have the true gunslinger at quarterback anymore, but I'm going to show you what this veer and shoot can do again, a la, what we did a couple years ago, with another quarterback who I don't think was, immensely gifted, but the season, in 22, I mean, look, the numbers that were put up then were insane. And so if you can, replicate even a modicum of that success, again, I think against a schedule that sets up fairly well for Tennessee, especially when you're comparing it to some of these other playoff teams, a la A&M, obviously Florida. I don't think Auburn is a playoff team at all, but, Hugh is kind of talking out of both ends of his mouth, and reared, throughout the offseason. But those teams have, Oklahoma, just hellacious schedules. Tennessee doesn't fit that bill. The one thing I am curious about, I will say, and kind of want to pick your brain on here, a lot of the pushback I got on that tweet was, Jesse, our culture's great. Josh has told us that the culture's great, and behind the scenes, everyone says the culture's great, and all the reporters are saying the culture's great. Butch Jones was spitting that same stuff for years. I'm not saying the culture at Tennessee isn't great. I'm not saying that Josh doesn't have, his beat on the pulse there, and who knows if the boot Carter situation, handles itself, or he ends up getting booted off the team or whatever. That the culture, could absolutely be, dynamic and exactly what you're looking for. But we also don't really know what any team's culture is, from the best to the worst in the country, basically until they tee it up. And then you're going to see what those guys, how hard they fight for the guy next to them.
Well, it's funny because, like, even then you could have the best culture in the world and just not have enough talent, and it's not going to win you games. But, like, you could be really talented and have bad culture and lose. But it's funny because, that's what I was saying about Butch. Like, it's harder to listen to that nonsense when you're underachieving and you're going 8-4 in 2015 when you probably should have been 10-2, and you're doing the same thing in 2016. So it's easy to really question that. But look, you can feel free to answer this question or not, but you cover the team. You worked for, the main gig in town when it came to breaking news and reporting news and kind of being there at VolQuest. I'm sure there was plenty of stuff that you guys hear or you guys know that you're not necessarily putting out there. What's the fine line there? Because I feel like there's been some pushback now on those message boards of people saying like, hey, we're paying $13.99 a month. Will you break some news for us? Will you tell us what's actually going on? Like, how does that business work on the other side? I've always been fascinated by what is able to be put out there and what's not put out there. Like, what's the relationship and just how you make those decisions?
Well, every reporter, has stuff in their holster that they're not reporting. I mean, how many times do we see not even just VolQuest, but across sports these days? I think my man John Curtis on the Press Box podcast has dubbed it, the Now They Tell Us story.
Yeah.
And
after every NBA season, like the whole Karl Anthony Towns, it always gets the chopper gets sprayed for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And so that they just dump on the person that goes, has left town. So every reporter has a bunch of stuff in their holster that they're keeping because you're having to kind of massage those relationships. I will say that the fan sites, VolQuest, basically all these sites now, at On3, 247, all that, they're fan sites. They are having to do an even more delicate dance. And VolQuest, because it was the preeminent site in Knoxville, Tennessee is basically a professional sports team in the way it's covered and how, ardent their fan base is.
The money attached to it is 100% professional. Like it is a big deal.
It is a big deal. And so there's a balance there. I think that since I've left, honestly, John, it's become even more just kind of observing from afar, even more just kind of interesting and how the relationships have maybe have sowed even deepened because of the NIL and that kind of stuff. And kind of where everybody has kind of their finger in a bunch of different cookie jars.
Well, so it's always weird because you got hubs working for the university, like broad, Gamecast or Game Day, Tennessee, and then Austin's doing the NIL interviews and stuff. So there have been, you can call it conflict of interest, you can just call it relationships. I mean, there's things there you have to protect. So to me, it's really muddied that, like you're saying.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll never say an ill word about Brent Hubbs. Brent Hubbs is the greatest boss, literally the greatest boss I've ever worked for. One of the just good dudes. And he's built he has built an empire there.
Now he's the man. He's the man when it comes to Knoxville. And I do think the way he's moved around with those relationships, it's clearly worked. So please don't take that as a slight if anybody's listening
not at all.
I'm not.
No, not at all. And this from when I was there. I was a giant pariah on that site for better or worse in a lot of ways. I think in a lot of ways, Brent Hubbs would say that I brought a lot of fresh ideas and difference of opinions because I wasn't born and bred, a UT Vol that really, I think, helped that site in a lot of ways. And then there's some other ways that I think that, my time in Knoxville left because my wife is awesome. And, we were going to New York City to kind of continue her career. My career was able to dovetail with that as well. But I wasn't going to leave Knoxville, I wasn't going to leave VolQuest, if we weren't leaving Knoxville. And yet there might have been a time where it was like, all right, maybe this is time for me to leave. I've kind of,
you took a lot of hell.
I was burning hot, man. Gator Dog was burning hot.
Yeah, I was going to say, you took a lot of hell. I mean, you were a Florida Gator coming here to cover the Vols. But look, we lean into it. You see the backdrop, FANRUN Radio, FANRUN Sports. We lean into that side because I think ultimately that's where people want to be at. You talked about the fan sites. You called them what they are. And this Boo Carter reporting, to me, kind of mirrors that. I don't think people actually want bad news about their team. I don't think they want news that's going to paint their team in a bad light. It's funny because this Boo Carter story kind of became a national talking point because the fans were freaking out so much about it that it put it on people's radar to the point where VolQuest had to address it and had to talk about it. And then, of course, once they talk about it, it's fair game for everybody else to kind of say, well, it must be some legitimate smoke to it or a legitimate fire to the smoke because now it's getting addressed and then it, kind of snowballs from there.
Yeah, it's not just a Vol Nug, it's VolQuest.
Exactly. It's graduated from just a
See, I know the inside lingo for Tennessee fans.
There you go. That's it. But, we'll see what happens with Boo Carter, but it gets people frustrated, man, because, like I said, I don't think there's anything that I hear that the real reporters in town don't hear. And other people have more freedom to kind of talk about it, while other people have to kind of tiptoe and do certain things. And it's just fascinating to me because there have been some frustrations over the last couple of days over the Boo Carter stuff and just what you're able to say, what you're able to talk about. So I was interested Because, I mean, like Butch, like you said, I mean, he just had nonstop stuff while you were here. Like, it was nonstop rumors, nonstop behind the scenes, things coming apart at the seam. It was just nonstop.
He told the amount of whoppers that he told. I mean, he could have just been living on, what's that show up in Lake Wobegon? The old man show up in like Minnesota or whatever. It's like the old NPR, whatever. It's like a super famous old Tennessee fans will know what I'm talking about. But the guy would just tell these insane stories, and I think like the amount of whopper. But Butch came up to me. Silly story. He came up to me and Brent Hubbs one time. It was in the last season when he got fired, which he, tried to light me up when I asked him about getting basically, do you think you're going to get fired right after South Carolina? And he freaked out. But he came up to practice one time to me and Brent Hubbs and told just the most insane story about Jawan Jennings. And it was just it's just like, Butch, why are you even just making stuff up? It's just those days, man, crazy.
They were fun. So
they were funny.
Yeah. Well, there's a part of Tennessee fans, I think, that yearn for that chaos, that yearn to get back to being that meme school and to have something constantly to be mad about. So there's been a little chum in the water this offseason because of it, because otherwise Heupel's been pretty boring in terms of his personality. He never says anything, and for the most part, there hasn't been any drama attached to him. We'll see how that kind of plays out.
Pruitt was just 3 years too soon, man. If he came during the NIL era and had some of these same coaches, maybe Tennessee would be like the anarchy team, but they'd still be winning.
I got to say, I don't miss the Pruitt days. There's a part of me that misses the Butch days. There's not really any part of me that misses the Jeremy Pruitt days. But we're talking Tennessee Vols. We're talking 2025, the outlook. You kind of brought up Oklahoma. You brought up Florida. You talked about nobody's talking about Georgia. I guess nobody has to talk about Georgia. They're just kind of bored, and it's kind of like, hey, either Gunnar Stockton's going to be really good and they're going to win a national championship, or Gunnar Stockton's not very good and they'll finish 10-2. But as you kind of look at those other SEC teams, which one do you find to be the most intriguing?
I don't understand the groundswell of optimism, and it's by a lot of folks in the national media for Oklahoma. I just don't get it. I know they like Brent Venables, and really they like, Castiglione, the athletic director who's now retiring, and John Mateer, I think, is considered the sexiest, transfer quarterback, and they made a bunch of moves, and Jim Nagy from the Senior Bowl goes and takes the GM position. They've been in the headlines a lot. And there's this thing that's if they have all these pieces, and last year that, they were beat up at receiver and didn't have X and didn't have Y, had all these transfer offensive linemen. Have you seen that schedule? I mean, they got dogged by the SEC a year ago, and now the schedule just flips home and away. So it's basically just as hard. You don't get another home game because you're playing Texas, in the Cotton Bowl. I think John Mateer, to me, John, is like Jackie Chan. He's fun as hell to watch. He's wild. He's crazy. It's insane. But I don't know if that's going to work in the SEC. It's like
putting Jackie Chan in a rom-com, maybe. Hey, I want to see him do the punching, but I don't know if he can translate to a different genre. Okay,
yeah,
I kind of see what you're saying. Okay, yeah,
exactly, yeah. Okay. And I don't know. Maybe Deion Burks is his Tucker, but I don't know. He's going to need a little bit more. I just don't. John Mateer is a guy that could easily, in his first SEC start, the 5 interceptions. He's that much of just kind of a wild thing. He may score 5 touchdowns too, but on a given week, I don't know what I'm going to get from him. I still am very worried about that offensive line. I think the defense should be better because Venables is going to continue to kind of get that right. But for folks talking, playoff, I think there's easily just as big of a chance that they have a new head coach next season.
See, to me, that's the problem is it seems like they're heading in the right direction. And people love the Nagy hire and, him being the GM and kind of, it seemed like he had a good offseason, kind of solidifying the program, getting some good transfers. you know, and they seem to be able to bounce back from last year because, like you said, they were really just depleted. Trust me, Oklahoma fans argued with me all for like a month about how many wide receivers they had injured, how many offensive linemen they had injured, and how they were just as good as Tennessee, but blah, blah, blah. But I will say the fact that Venables is firmly on the hot seat, to me, that just changes the dynamic so much just because the first loss is going to feel like 5. And like I feel the same way about, you know, if Brian Kelly loses game 1 against Clemson, that's going to feel like 5 losses just because of where the vibes are coming into that season. Same for Mike Norvell at Florida State against, you know, in his first game. If they lose that first game against Alabama and you go from 2-10, and even though you're just 0-1, it just starts the season off on such a bad note. So when Oklahoma takes that first loss, how are they going to respond to it? How long can they go and show that they're a new Oklahoma? Because to me, it feels like they're a team that if they lose early, they're cooked.
Well, and what's the common denominator between all those teams you just mentioned and then the one team that you didn't, that this did happen to a year ago, but they were able to bounce back? Alabama or Florida State, LSU, and Oklahoma are all transfer portal crazy teams. Obviously, Florida State last 2 seasons, it crumbles on them, and their team just quits. They just quit. They flat out quit. LSU has not been a huge transfer portal team, but they are this year, so we're going to see what happens. Oklahoma made extremely heavy investments in the portal across both sides of the ball. Obviously, headliners being the receivers, being Mateer, Jaden Ott, but then a bunch of other guys as well. When you put this many, you know, eggs in that basket, and they're not necessarily invested in Oklahoma, they're not necessarily invested in Brent Venables, they're invested in their own futures. It's easy for them to just say, what does that loss mean? I know, I'm looking for me. The counter to that is Florida last year got their teeth kicked in the first month of the season. They looked terrible. Got beat like a dog, you know, by Miami at home in week 1. You lose to Texas A&M. You're stumbling, but those were almost all Billy Napier's guys. And they rallied around them. And they didn't quit. And hell, they end up winning 8 or 9 games by the end of eight games, I think, by the end of the season. Where suddenly there's crazy optimism in Gainesville, you know, that they can do something. So it's going to be interesting with just kind of, you know, Texas Tech's going to have this same thing. That's a whole lot of new fish in the tank. And what's that alchemy going to be like? Because you get some different fish and they start fighting. And it ain't going the way you think it's going to go.
So you're selling Oklahoma. You talked about Florida kind of having that continuity, kind of having the coach they're playing for that recruited them, not necessarily transfer guys. Does that mean you're buying Florida in 2025?
I've kind of, if I'm kind of grouping or tiering some of these teams, I would have like Oklahoma, Florida, Texas A&M, and Auburn kind of all in the same tier. And I am hard selling Auburn and Oklahoma, and I think I'm buying Florida and A&M.
Okay.
I don't know if they're necessarily a playoff team. I think that, you know, there's folks in Gainesville that are certainly talking like they think they're going to be a playoff team.
Man, with that schedule, see, to me, they're like Oklahoma, like that schedule. And you're right, they rallied last year. You said because of Billy Napier, which I don't disagree with, but I also think they were able to kind of break the glass and bust out the freshman 5-star that gave them a shot in the arm for the future, right? It was able to kind of get the vibes up. They already got him playing this year. There's no more cards to throw down. There's no ace up the sleeve. So now if Florida loses 2 or 3 games before they get to the middle of October, how does that team, how does that fan base respond to that? That's my biggest question with Florida, because I don't disagree. There's a lot of blue chip talent there. They check the blue chip ratio checkbox. I mean, they're at, I think 64% or so of really talented players. But my question is, what happens if they lose early, much like Oklahoma? Because my personal thought on a Florida fan base, and I don't take offense to this, Gator Dog, but my personal thought on it is
the dog is that my whole family is UGA, so I got that blood in me too.
Okay. Well, I didn't know that's where the dog came from. I always wondered that.
Yeah.
Okay. does the Florida fan base get excited for an 8-4 season while a lot of people are sitting there talking about maybe making the playoffs? So yeah, like once that third loss happens and you're like, oh man, there goes the magical season. Tennessee gets them in November this year. And I've said like, hey, that might actually end up being a trap game for Tennessee if Florida's like 5-5 or 6-4, and all of a sudden the fan base isn't as raucous, and maybe, just the vibes are completely different there because, like I said, Florida's got the talent. They just got a really, really tough schedule.
No. I mean, Billy still has kind of a win or else mandate, and okay. I think that else is he probably needs to go 9-3.
Okay.
And Florida, you could say this about any team in the country with a really good quarterback. If you take away, player X, their team's going to crumble. But I think so much. Jaden Baugh is awesome. The running back. I think Florida's offensive line is probably really sneaky good and probably one of the better units, not only in the SEC but the entire country. But I do think so much is kind of hinging on DJ Lagway's ability to be kind of a Superman. If that shoulder does, if he does hurt that shoulder a little bit, if he does get dinged up, you know who Florida's backup quarterback is?
No. Is that the point?
Okay,
I know it was a rhetorical question.
No, here's the name for Tennessee fans. It's Harrison Bailey.
Oh, yeah, he is on the roster. Is he number 2 on the depth
chart? Yes.
Oh,
and he is on his 4th school. And again,
I thought he was like a grad transfer, like, hey, I'm going to get into coaching. Like, I knew he was at Florida, but I didn't think he was actually in the mix there at all.
Yeah, so they had somebody else that transferred away, I believe, and so he's right there next in line. So that's scary, but I think Florida offensive, defensive lines, I think Florida's going to be even better. They've kind of continued there. Then you have Lagway. And then with A&M, I know they're not on Tennessee's schedule. To me, if they have everything right except the quarterback, I'm not a big believer in Marcel Reed. But I think if Elko can win 9 or 10 games at Duke, with the amount of talent he has now at A&M, I don't see why they couldn't push for like a 10-win season.
Why do you think that people are so high on Lagway, but not talking about Marcel Reed in the same way? Because you said you're not high on him there either. Like, and you didn't necessarily say you're high on Lagway, but like Marcel Reed, I mean, he was a top-ish. How big was he as a prospect? I mean, I guess he was just a 4-star. I guess that's the difference, is that Lagway was a big-time 5-star and Reed wasn't.
I think there's also for like, and I'm not qualifying myself as like some grade 8 ball knower. I mean, I like to watch cut-ups. I like to watch that kind of stuff. But if you talk to the real ball knowers, they will tell you that all those layups that Nico missed, it might have been even worse, but just maybe not as pronounced because he wasn't as popular of a player as Iamaleava, that Marcel Reed just could not hit the layups.
Okay.
And that might have been some of the hesitation about why Elko kind of kept waffling between he and Connor Wegman, throughout the fall, until he kind of was just forced to say, hey, Wegman's not healthy. We got to roll with Marcel. Again, we saw it against South Carolina, some of these teams, what Marcel Reed was able to do. We also saw in some of those games where, he couldn't move it at all, whether it was against Texas and some of those other defenses.
Yeah, I mean, admittedly, I wasn't necessarily locked into Florida when Lagway was starting, but just the games I did watch, the one really, really horrible interception against Tennessee that he threw into zone coverage there at the end of the third quarter. But he did follow it up with tying the game at the end of regulation. So, I mean, I saw the flash there, but just the statistics and, like, especially if you remove Sanford from the schedule, like it just didn't jump out to me. But everyone's so high on him and calling him a top 1 or 2 quarterback in the conference. So I was curious where you thought all that was necessarily coming from.
Well,
I think I posed it as Marcel Reed, but
right now, I think a lot of it with Lagway is just few guys, not only in the SEC, but I think few guys in the country are able to push the ball vertically the way he can. And I mean, like from hitting layered throws, over the middle, to hitting deep posts, to hitting these, fade corners. I think that, and so when you can hit those home runs, and he had one game, I forget, was it Kentucky or one of those games, or it might have actually been that silly Stanford game you're talking about. It was against somebody. It was against some slappy, but he did hit it was like 10 throws over 20 yards or something. It was just insane.
He had like 450 yards against them on like 25 completions or like 20 completions, but it was Samford. Those explosive air yards and those big chunk plays. His statistics looked a lot better in that partly because of that game. But I don't know.
100%.
Maybe that's a Tennessee fan in me coming out. Real quick, kind of last thing I want to get to about the SEC today, but you talked about that tier of 4 you have. So let's run through Jesse's tiers. Who do you consider at the top of the pyramid this season in the SEC? Give me your elite category. How many teams are in it? Who's in it?
I think right now, as we sit here just for the end of July, I'm
putting you on the spot. You're putting me on
the spot, but I've been doing a lot of thinking and kind of getting stuff together before the season. I think Alabama's going to win the league. But that is kind of a bet on Ty Simpson and Ryan Grubb and that new offensive look, kind of finding some cohesion there. But I think if you're doing a tier, I'm going to go Alabama, Texas, Georgia in some order.
Okay. You ain't got to order them. They're just hanging out together at the top of the pyramid. So that's they're
just hanging out together. They're just hanging out together.
We'll call that the championship tier, the teams that can legitimately win a national championship. I think that's fair. Let's go now to like the playoff contender tier. Or let's call this, I don't know how you want to do it. Do you have like likely to make the playoffs and then playoff contenders, or do you just want to lump like all the playoff contenders together?
So then I would go LSU. I'll go LSU. I think probably in their own tier.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. And then
playoff
I think
luck category, like is that the name we're going to call this? Like you think that's a playoff team, or what?
I think they should be a playoff team.
Okay, so they should make the playoffs. Okay,
should make the. If you have invested what they have invested on that roster, and you have what I think is the best quarterback coming back in the SEC in Nussmeier, you should make the playoff.
Okay,
got the best quarterback. It made all those investments, and I think while I've dogged them a lot, no one has actually, ironically, been higher on Brian Kelly, I think, in terms of a lot of national media folks over the last 4 or 5 years, and where I have put him in the head coach rankings compared to some of my counterparts. So I got them in their own tier. Then I would probably have Tennessee in basically as almost like just maybe like one step above, but Tennessee with that aforementioned group that we mentioned. A&M, Oklahoma,
Florida, Oklahoma.
Yeah.
Okay.
Probably I have Ole Miss and Missouri next. The thing is that I don't think Missouri is going to be that good, but I think that schedule is such a joke that Eli could find his way to 10 wins.
Well, they just gave him a big extension. They gave him a big extension right before we started recording, so he has got some new money, and I really.
Oh, and South Carolina's in that tier is on that list with them.
Okay, so you got South Carolina below Tennessee and below Florida and below A&M.
Yes, which is probably that might be discounting them a little bit. Again, that's a lot of trend. They have a lot to replace. There. I like Shane. Shane's a well-liked guy, but his personality is not for everyone. Tennessee fans certainly feel that way for certain. Josh Heupel feels that way for certain.
Do you buy into the cheating? Do you buy into that they were cheating in 2022, or like reaping the benefits of Michigan's cheating? Because that's the conspiracy, is that Michigan and Clemson were kind of working together because Clemson was playing South Carolina. Michigan was working with South Carolina because they played both Tennessee and Clemson. Do you buy into that?
I buy that the conspiracy not only exists but is so popular that it is believable enough for folks to run with it.
It felt a lot more believable before South Carolina was pretty good last year.
Yeah, and then they beat Clemson again.
Yeah, whenever they just kind of had that blip where all of a sudden they're really good and beat 2 top 10 teams back-to-back weeks and then sucked All the other time, it was a lot more believable than like after they kind of bounced back. With Beamer, he doesn't really rub me the wrong way. I don't really care too much about him either way, but I will say my biggest question about them is just how he behaves as someone that's not in an underdog role this year. Like I thought last year they were able to do the scrappy underdog, nobody believes in us thing. But now this year they actually have some expectations and some actual like pressure on him.
Yeah, I mean and that goes for the quarterback too. I mean, the quarterback's getting talked like how Carson Beck was getting talked about a year ago. It's like, a top 10 NFL draft pick, and those are lofty expectations for a kid who has not played a ton of ball. And I think Lenoris is good. But yeah, there's South Carolina suddenly, and that fan base is gonna kind of stick the thumb on that pressure too, because now that Shane's talked about, we can win the SEC and that kind of stuff. Well, you start speaking that vernacular, they're going to start having those expectations.
Let's credit to Hugh Freeze for doing the opposite. He's just like, hey, if we can make a bowl game, guys, that's a big success. If we can find 6 wins.
Then them checks stopped coming, and he's like, oh, snap, I better start talking playoff again. So he said we expect to make the playoffs at SEC Media Days after all them checks stopped.
The check stopped, and all of a sudden people said, well, if we're not going to be very good, why the hell are you playing so much golf? Like, why don't you get out there and help practice? And he's like, well, hold on. I was like, golf. Everything's fine. We're going to be good.
And then they're like, why aren't you better at golf? There's other coaches better than you, and they don't play as much.
Hugh can't win for losing. Poor Hugh. Poor little Hugh. All right, Jesse, anything else you want to get on record? Anything you want to get off your chest? I assume about college football, but hell, you could talk anything else you want. Music, reality TV.
I'll ask you one NFL question. How happy are you that Will Levis is out for the season so they can just go ahead and let Cam Ward do it?
Well, he was not Will Levis was not standing in between Cam Ward doing it and not doing it. But I am happy that Will Levis, I assume the shoulder surgery means he's just gone and like won't be around the facility, won't be the backup. Like that makes me happy that I won't have to see him. Although I maintain they would have just released him before the season if they couldn't trade him, just because I think it's really awkward when you lose your starting job, you don't really get to hang out in the locker room afterwards.
They don't want him infiltrating Cam with some Mayo brain. So,
were you surprised that he sucked in the NFL after watching him at Kentucky? Yeah, were you surprised, or did you never really buy into him as a viable option?
Was high on his just raw tools, but I was never overly impressed with him as a quarterback. Obviously, I mean, whether he did or did not get a fair shake at Penn State, it wasn't like he didn't beat out some like world beater there, or couldn't beat out some world beater there. Kentucky, I mean, his numbers were never overly impressive. I think he was tough as hell. He would take a beating and get up and be gritty and all that. But I was never overly impressed. And his entire, I wrote a big column at On3 right after that draft, that his entire kind of draft ecosystem or whatever was just kind of, showed you just how manufactured all this stuff was. That basically it was like he was never going to be a top 5 pick, and yet that he got those expectations, and then that bet came, and then all this kind of stuff, and then obviously his career is kind of tumbled off the tracks a little bit. We'll see if he's able to find fresh start somewhere else.
One of my favorite things about him last thing was just whenever the reports came out about him at the Manning Passing Academy or doing something with Peyton Manning before the draft, and said like that, Peyton was taking questions from him, and his question was about like endorsements and like maximizing earning potential off the field. And I said, this guy ain't got it. This guy ain't. If that's like the thing you're worried about before you're even playing, like he ain't got it. Never mind. All right, Jesse, appreciate you hopping on. Appreciate you talking some ball with us. Maybe we'll do it again if people like it. We'll talk some SEC, because I need an expert ball knower, because I watch a lot of Tennessee and I know the conference, but I need somebody that really knows the conference to talk about. So if people like it, maybe we'll do it again.
Sounds good, John.
You're headed on vacation?
Yeah, man.
Have a great one.
Headed to the beach. See you, man.
All right. Have fun. Talk to you later, brother.